Well, we're in a series that we started last week with our introduction. And this series is, I'm using the book Better Decisions, Fewer Regrets by Andy Stanley. And Andy has a large church in the Atlanta area, North Point. And he's written several books, and he's a very popular preacher and teacher. And he's going to help us throughout this series to ask ourselves a series of questions that can help us to make better decisions and have fewer regrets. And the first question then that we come upon in this series is, am I being honest with myself? Am I being honest with myself really? As I listen to Paul's words about doing what he doesn't want to do, even though he knows what he should be doing, that question came to mind for me. Because if I was being honest with myself, then wouldn't the struggle at least be a little easier? Because I would try to understand why I was doing what I was doing. It's, I guess, a question of personal integrity then. Do I have personal integrity? Do I say what I am going to do and follow through with that? Do I say what I mean, or do I mean something else? Am I trying to make myself look better, or to blame somebody else and not take responsibility? What's going on in my head as I make those decisions? What's going on in my heart as I make those decisions? Am I really being honest with myself? Well, who do you think that the easiest person in the whole world is to fool? Yourself, that's right. I'm surprised somebody didn't say something different, but Andy and I think our own personal experience would testify to the fact that the easiest person to fool is the person that we look at in the mirror every day. And why is that? Well, last time we talked about how easy it is for us to convince ourselves or to sell ourselves on certain things that we convince ourselves that we need. And then because we convince ourselves we need these things in our life, or we want these things in our life, then we come up with this elaborate thing which helps us or hurts us either way in making a decision. Are we really being honest with ourselves? Are we being honest with ourselves? Or are we lying to ourselves? Are we, as Paul points out in these verses, are we knowing what we should do but convincing ourselves that it's all right to do what we really want to do? Are we selling ourselves on a bad decision that may lead to a later regret? Well, I think we do that all the time. The reality is, you can't make good decisions if you're lying to yourself. If you're looking in that mirror and you're trying to sell yourself on a good idea or a decision, then you're really probably lying to yourself. And then once you give yourself that lie or that half-truth maybe that's a little bit more palatable, then we justify our actions. And we have to justify our actions because if we don't justify our actions, then there's this inner conflict, as Paul points out in the Scriptures. Did you sense that conflict in Paul? There was that inner conflict of, well, I know what's right, but I don't do what's right. I do what I don't want to do, and I fall into my sinful nature. Can't live in that tension. So to remedy that tension that we can find ourselves in, if we're convincing ourselves or selling ourselves on a particular decision or action, what we do is we justify it. We minimize it. We come up with a big story around it so that it doesn't cause us to be in conflict with ourselves. I mean, the worst person you can fight with is yourself, right? It's not a comfortable place. And let me give you a real simple, easy example of that. It doesn't matter where I'm at, if I'm at home or if I'm out to eat or we're having a fellowship meal. There's always that temptation for me to end the meal with dessert, right? And if you're at a restaurant, sometimes they bring things out to your table, right? Like, or the waitress will come by. Oh, we have this really awesome, I don't know, hot fudge brownie sundae thing with whipped cream and cherries and everything else. And I just start going, oh my gosh, sounds so good. And it doesn't matter how full I am. It sounds good. I want that thing. But in the back of my mind, I'm going, well, what is this going to do to my blood sugar? It's going to spike up my blood sugar, and then I'm going to pay for it the rest of the night. I found out that if I eat a lot of sugar during the day, I don't sleep good at night. I don't know whether, if you're type 2 diabetic, if you experience that or not, but I get real restless. I can't sleep at night because all that sugar in my system. But anyway, you know, the waitress or whatever is trying to convince me, or if I'm in the fellowship hall and somebody makes a peach cobbler and there's ice cream there, I just can't resist. And it sounds so good, and I'm thinking, and I start to justify, well, you know, I didn't have many carbs today. I could probably get away with this dessert. I'd be all right because I can have X amount of carbs per day, and well, this would put me a little over, but, you know, and then, you know, I've got my conscience working on me. Should I have dessert? Shouldn't I have dessert? Shouldn't I have? And I finally, you know, I'll go up the first time. This is me. Well, I'll just get a little taste. Are you like that? I'll just get a spoonful or two. Just a little taste. That's all I need. I go back, get that taste. And the next thing you know, I'm there just heaping it on, you know, heaping it in that bowl. And I've forgotten all about it. Why? Because I wanted it so bad that I've convinced myself it'll be all right. There's always tomorrow. Right? You might have the same thing happen to you when you make that New Year's resolution, right? You have the best intentions. You're going to start an exercise program. And the alarm goes off that next morning at 6:30 or 5 a.m. or whatever, and you hit the snooze and say, I'll start it tomorrow. Right? Because you've convinced yourself you want to exercise, but not really. You want that dessert, but you know you can't have that dessert. Now, those are really simple things, and they're not going to be decisions that you make that are going to have long-term consequences. But what about when it comes to relationships and your profession and finances and those major decisions in your life that are going to affect not only you, but everybody around you? What if you sell yourself on a bad decision? Simply because you've convinced yourself and justified it to yourself that it'll be okay. What if that happens? Well, maybe before you start thinking about that, maybe we need to go into why it happened. Erin Brown is an author, and she came up with this term, plastic truth. Have you ever heard of a plastic truth? If you have, that's great. If you haven't, think of that common buzzword that we hear, or buzzwords that we hear all the time, false narratives. I know I preached on false narratives and things like that, and that just seems to be kind of a cultural buzz term these days. So I like the thing now, plastic truths. And what she says about plastic truths is this. What we've said so many times in our heads becomes our plastic truth. Over time, these fake parts of our own story, the pieces we've made up, actually cement the gaps in the real truth. False narratives become a crutch. We tell ourselves internal stories to avoid facing our mistake. It's oh so much easier to create a story where someone else is to blame than to confront the tough things in life. Part of that justification that we use when we make a decision, and then maybe it's a bad decision, is we don't want to take responsibility for that decision if it turns out bad. And so we'll blame it on something or someone else. But as we said last week, bad news is you are responsible ultimately for every decision that you have made. Now, you could say it was somebody else's fault. The circumstances could have been such that you can blame it on circumstances, but even there, you had the power to choose how to react to the circumstances or how to respond to the person that you want to place the blame on. Ultimately, you're responsible for your decision. There's no getting around it. If you decide not to exercise and you go to the doctor and he says you've got high blood pressure or you've got cholesterol buildup or whatever else, you've made a choice. I won't exercise, I'll just take a pill. If I make the choice to have a dessert or maybe an extra dessert on top of dessert, I can make the choice either to have the dessert or I'll just take an extra metformin, right? Or I'll just not sleep tonight, whatever the case. Be irritable in the morning. The choice is mine. There's nobody else to blame but me. There's nobody else to blame than you for the decisions that you're making. But we fool ourselves all the time. We lie to ourselves. We tell half-truths. We make up stories to avoid the mistakes, to avoid taking responsibility for the decisions that we've made. Remedy to that is something that I've learned about in a group that I participate in. And they say this. They say that rigorous honesty is the first rule of recovery. In other words, you can't lie to yourself. You can't lie to others. You have to practice rigorous honesty. You have to root out all the lies, the half-truths, the stories that make you look good or justify your decisions. Get to the heart of making better decisions. Because nothing changes until we're brutally honest with the person. It's a reality. It's a fact. And if we're going on those stories, those half-truths, those lies, then we're dealing with a false premise. And if we're dealing with if we start at a false premise, what's the result? A faulty result, right? A faulty decision. That's where this question comes in then. Am I being honest with myself? Am I being honest with myself, really? That's hard. Not only do we make up stories and half-truths and everything else, but we've got something else that's set up against us because like I talked about last time, once we get our heart set on something, it's hard to budge us, right? I don't know about you, but I'm an all or none person, okay? What that means is I'm either all in on something or I don't want to deal with it at all. But when I'm all in on something, Katie, bar the door because it's going to happen. I'm going to do everything in my power to make that happen because that's what I want. And I get what I want. I don't know about you, but that's how I work. Maybe it's not good. Sometimes it's terrible. Sometimes I have more regrets than good decisions. But what happens in that kind of thinking, that all or none, or most people's thinking really, whether you're an all or none or not, is that once we get our heart set on something, it sends a message to the brain. And it says, brain, I really want this. You've got to get it for me, brain. I'm pleading with you. Please, please, please. The brain's like, well, you really don't need that. Just you want that. But the brain doesn't want to disappoint the heart, so what the brain does is it takes that want that you have and it tells the rest of your system, it convinces itself that it's not just a want. Oh man, you need this. You could not possibly survive without it. Like when you fall in love the first, time, the first couple of weeks, you're convinced that there's no way on God's green earth that you cannot live without that person in your life. Right? I mean, they do no wrong. And it's amazing how much you have in common. And you set your heart to it, and your brain says, oh, I need this person. I'll do anything. How many of us, so I'm not a huge fan of country music. I like it. But I have found myself in dating relationships that, man, I love country music. Give me a little bit of George Strait or Garth Brooks. Woo! Yeah. And I put my cowboy boots on. Why? Because I'm trying to, I'm in the chase mode, right? I'm all in. I need this. I want this relationship. So I really don't like country music. So anyway, so the brain begins to construct all these rationales, right? Well, country music isn't that bad, right? It's got a pretty good beat. Some of the newer stuff isn't bad. I mean, it's not about all breaking down trucks, the dog runs away, and the wife leaves you, right? So it's not that bad. So you make these rationales and justifications about why you need it. And before you know it, you're really lying to yourself and other people. You're putting out this front. You're telling another story. You're giving half-truths. And it's all to get what you think that you need. You want it. You need it. It's going to happen. Jeremiah the prophet in the Scriptures, Old Testament. Now, Jeremiah was a young prophet. He used to be part of the court, but God called him to be a prophet. And he served several kings in Israel. It was a bad time for Israel. Israel was under Babylonian oppression, and King Nebuchadnezzar was known for collecting kings. When he went into an area and he conquered that region or that other kingdom, what he would do would be he would capture the king alive. And then he would put that king in gold chains, and he would have them in the court. And when he called for them, they would march into the court under their gold chains, and they would put their hand on the shoulder of the king before them. And they'd be marched out in front of the court or in front of important dignitaries to show the power that Nebuchadnezzar had. And not only were they bound in gold chains, but the reason why they had to put their hand on the person's shoulder ahead of them, because Nebuchadnezzar made sure they couldn't see. Made sure they were blind. Like to collect. These kings of Israel knew about Nebuchadnezzar's reputation. And Jeremiah would warn them, if you do something against Nebuchadnezzar, you will end up like that in the king's court, and bad things will happen. But you know what? These kings of Israel did not ever learn. They went off and did their own thing, like trying to make friends with Egypt and overthrow Babylon and everything else. And once Nebuchadnezzar got wind of it, he crushed it, collected them, bound them up in gold chains, blinded them. Jeremiah says, don't do it. And the kings, being the king, I guess that's the good thing about being a king, right? You don't have to listen to anybody else. You can do what you want to do. But they didn't listen. They kept making bad decisions. And finally, Zedekiah was the last king of Israel, and he did the exact same thing. He made a pact with Egypt. Nebuchadnezzar caught wind, came to Israel, wiped them out, took Zedekiah to be his prisoner. It prompted Jeremiah to write these words. This is why I'm telling the story. The heart is deceitful above all things. These kings had their hearts set on doing something they wanted to do. didn't work. It didn't matter. And finally, Jeremiah writes, the heart is deceitful above all things, but then he goes on and says, it's beyond all cure. Then he goes on even farther. He says, the heart is deceitful above all things. It's beyond all cure. Who can understand it? And that's where we get into this Romans text now, isn't it? Do what I don't want to do and don't do what I should do. Don't understand why we do things, make bad decisions. Part of it's not being honest with ourselves. So what do? How do you be honest with yourself? Well, the first thing you do, and you might want to do this. Just a suggestion. Look in the mirror. And admit, maybe for the first time, maybe I'm not being totally honest with myself. Maybe I don't think I am who I think I am. Maybe I've made a few mistakes along the way. Maybe I don't have all the answers. Maybe I've told stories to make myself look better than I actually am. You know, heard it said at least, admitting it is half the problem. You've got to admit and recognize that we maybe aren't being fully honest with ourselves. The second thing is we have to ask. We have to ask that question. Am I being honest with myself? Don't just ask it once. Ask it twice. Am I being honest with myself? And then add the word really. Take that deep, hard look in the mirror and ask that deep, probing, brutal question of yourself. And it comes to your next big decision. And third, be curious. You're probably wondering about, well, where does that come from? Emotional curiosity is what I'm talking about. You know, it's easy for us, and it's all around the world. It's in our culture. I think it's part of our human nature almost to be a critic, right? I don't know how many times that everything could go right, but yet that one thing that goes wrong, somebody will key in on, right? Somebody will make sure they tell you that didn't go right. So like, let's say it's a worship service. I'll just pick on that. So everything in the worship service goes right, but as somebody comes out the door, they'll go, well, I really didn't like X, Y, or Z. It's easy to be the critic, and if you're the critic, let me just say it in the terms of worship, you're focused in on the wrong thing. You should be focused in on worship God, but that's beyond the point. It's easy to criticize, to judge, and to look at the negatives, but it's something totally else. If you're emotionally curious, then you're a student. You're always open to learning something new rather than criticizing what you don't like. I think about that as very important because what do they call followers of Jesus? Disciples. What does that word disciple mean? Learner, student. See, we're not called to be critics. We're called to be learners, open to new things, new possibilities. Not critics, but that takes emotional curiosity. You have to be willing to look at things in a new way. The decisions we make, ourselves, the stories we're telling, how we act. And when we do that, we are reminded of those words that Jesus gave us. Then, when you're emotionally curious, when you become a learner, when you've admitted that maybe you're not telling yourself the whole truth, if you've asked yourself the tough question, then Jesus' words come true when he said in John 8:32, then you will know the truth. Then maybe we'll do what we're supposed to do instead of do what we don't want to do. Maybe then we'll make better decisions. Let me wrap it up. Stanley gives a list of questions. And, you may not be at this place in your life at this time. This may not be your circumstances in life. But maybe it is. Maybe these are some of the questions you need to look in the mirror and ask. Okay? Listen to these questions. Why are you buying that? Why are you moving? Why do you continue to go out with him or her? Really? Why did you file for divorce? Really? What's the real reason you moved in? What's the real reason you moved out? Why are you taking that job? Really? What's the reason you don't call your kids? Mom, your dad, your brothers, your sisters? Some of those questions are pretty brutal, aren't they? It goes beyond just, well, I can make more money. Well, I love them. I'm mad at them. I need this thing that I'm buying. They're brutal and terrifying and clarifying all at the same time. And they're also hopeful, liberating, empowering. We have to have the courage to look in that mirror. Ask ourselves that question. Am I being honest with myself really? You have to figure out why we do what we do. Dr. Phil says there's always a reward, right? You're acting in a particular way because you're getting something out of it. So this week I want you to make the commitment. Make a commitment with me. Ask yourself this question, or to make this a statement. Live by. I will not lie to myself even when truth makes me feel bad. I will not lie to myself even when truth makes me feel bad. That's the challenge this week. So let's wrap it up with the word. Gracious and loving God, sometimes we're a mystery even to ourselves. We know that you know us better than we know ourselves, that you know what we're going to do even before we do it, that you know the decision we're going to make before we even make that decision. We know that there might not be a cure, as Jeremiah says, but there's a hope. There's a hope that rests in you. A hope knowing that we aren't in this alone. That if we're willing to participate with you, to ask the questions of admitting to ourselves, maybe we're lying. Asking that question, am I being honest? And being emotionally curious, Lord, we know that through your power, you'll help us to make the right decision. You'll help us to follow your will for our lives. Be faithful disciples, learners. So empower us this week. Be honest with ourselves regardless of the outcome, regardless how we